Thanks very much for the initial introductions there, Monica, and for setting this up. Welcome to Dr. Nick Bland, who will be giving our first in a series of seminars in this academic year. This seminar is associated both with our School of Applied Sciences at Edinburgh Napier University and also with the Scottish Institute for Policing Research, of which I'm director. So I have great pleasure in welcoming Nick Bland to deliver this seminar. Nick is both based at the Scottish Government, but he's also on the International Advisory Committee for SIPR. And in addition, last year we appointed Nick as a visiting professor at Edinburgh Napier University. So I'm really looking forward to what Nick has to say about deliberative democracy and his experience of citizen participation, and also how he's going to connect that to his background in policing research and also his significant influence on policing reform in a Scottish context. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Nick now, and I'll also facilitate Q&A towards the end of the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Liz, and many thanks also to Monica for setting this up. It's not always straightforward, so greatly appreciate that. And finally, thanks very much for everybody else coming online today to listen to this. Appreciate your interest. It was described as a fascinating presentation on Twitter by Monica, I guess. So I will do my best to meet that level, but I also hope that you will contribute together with me to co-producing a fascinating Q&A as well. So I look forward to that. Just to suppose say a little bit by way of background about me and in a sense my my introduction into this area of work, in this area of thought and practice. So I've been involved in policing research for well over 20 years, initially at the Home Office, and in a number of the bits of work that I did there, I became increasingly interested in the specific aspects of the relationship between the police and the public. I explored that in terms of public expectations of policing, about the experience between the police and the public in operational encounters on the street in stop and search. And then more latterly, I've had the opportunity in a number of different settings, out on secondment at Edinburgh University, and now back within the Scottish Government, to get increasingly interested in and have the opportunity to explore and practice deliberative approaches. And so in this talk, in a sense, as Liz suggested, I'm seeking to bring those two things together. The thoughts, the ideas of deliberative democracy and the practices of deliberative approaches, and what they mean in the specific context of policing. So sticking on the glasses so that I can actually read my slides. Let me start with the next slide then, in a sense setting out where I'm starting from in terms of considerations of democracy and citizen participation. And in terms of the ambition in thinking about democracy and citizen participation within a democratic society, this quote for me just sums it up ideally by Albert Zuhr, who I'm going to be making reference to through the presentation. Democracy is simply the sharing of power to handle collective problems, to shape a common public life with others who are not the same as us. So my concern is going to be about thinking about that sharing of power and how we handle collective problems that we as citizens have a shared interest in, a shared concern for, but do not naturally within our existing system of representative democracy and with public administrative elites involved in the responsibility of the administration of that, where is the role for citizens? And so the contemporary challenge really has become more and more visible, acute. I think you would all recognize this in talks about a democratic recession, post-truth, alternative facts, the rise of populist governments. So in a sense, the sort of crisis of democracy is one context for this, but also I think from the kind of public administration government side, an increasing concern with the participation of citizens, for the legitimacy of government, for the legitimacy of public administration, but also for the efficient and effective running of that citizens have a part to play. And so the contemporary challenge, although expressed by Dewey nearly 100 years ago, that the political elements in the constitution of the human being, these having to do with citizenship, are crowded to one side. That in a sense, in contemporary society, how is it that we create the space, the opportunity for that political element of us as citizens to have shape, be operationalized? In short, thinking about a concern for greater public participation in decisions about these collective problems. How do we go about that? So over the next 20-25 minutes or so, what I'm going to do is review some of the normative and deliberative ideals in deliberative democratic theory, but then also look at how those ideas, those theories have been operationalized in practice, and what has been described as a kind of increasing deliberative wave, the kind of increasing use of deliberative approaches to engage with the public. Having looked at that and reviewed how things look in practice, I want to then discuss some of the critiques, some of the problematization of that kind of position, both theoretically and in the way it looks in practice, and in particular drawing on the ideas of Albert Zur and democratic professionals to speak more about the specific role that public servants can, and I think I would argue should play, in enabling and encouraging and supporting that public participation. And having gone through those ideas, through those various stages, I then want to take those ideas and those evidence of those practices and apply them within the policing context, both in terms of a specific example of my use of a deliberative approach, but also then to explore really the future potential, the future possibilities. And I think to offer some concluding remarks that are very much, in a sense, an invitation to you to join in a consideration of those thoughts, those reflections. So to start, I want to make some kind of clear definitions of what we're talking about in relation to deliberation and deliberative democracy. And I find this quote from the Handbook of Deliberative Democracy to the point, but also drawing out two key elements to this. The first, that deliberative democracy is an ideal, and I think all of those who would profess to be deliberative democrats, deliberative democratic theorists, recognize it as an ideal to be aimed for, but perhaps with a realistic appreciation that it doesn't necessarily mean it can be reached, but is something to be striving for. But that in that people are coming together on the basis of equal status and mutual respect. Now, this isn't something that's given perhaps as much emphasis in talks about deliberation, is the importance of these values. And I'll seek to come back to that. But there's this important expression of values, really values around citizenship, that we have equal status and there is mutual respect in processes of deliberation and in a democracy that would be applying deliberative approaches. And that deliberation itself as an activity is minimally mutual communication that involves weighing and reflecting on preferences, values and interests regarding matters of common concern. So that notion of collective interest, collective problems, common concern, again being emphasized, as I said earlier, but with an absolute emphasis on this mutual communication. So this is about talk, deliberation is very much a kind of talk-centric focus. And again, I'll say more about that. So where, in a sense, deliberation moves beyond simple participation, the notion of citizens participating in one way or another within democracy and decision-making, is a concern not just for increasing participation, for how many citizens have an opportunity to take part, but also about how well they take part. So it's not just the quantity of participation, but the particular quality and character of the participation that is enabled and supported. So the significance of deliberation is that in practice is that we are seeking to move from existing methods that often capture, in a sense, our aggregated, summed up expressions of individual private preference. So that be through voting and opinion polls are two very well used mechanisms, that they really just add together, aggregate our individual expressions of what we would prefer as an individual. So that's a very kind of self-regarding, what do I as Nick Bland prefer about this in terms of political party in a vote, or my opinion on a social issue. Deliberation focuses on methods that actually move us away from that private focus, from that individualized focus, to one of consideration of the collective public interest. And it does that by facilitating the exchange of public reasons, the justifications for our opinions between each other, between citizens. So this is about not just an expression of an opinion, but the sharing with each other of the reasons for the views that we hold. And in expressing those reasons, giving those justifications for the views that we hold, that in a sense is the material, the fruit for much better engagement and discussion, the sharing of those reasons, the understanding for the underpinning of that opinion or that view. So this is not just about what your view is, but why you hold that view. So in this next slide, we now move to considerations of, given those ideas about deliberation and the focus on that exchange of reasons, how that plays out in practice. And there are three key dimensions to this. The first is that in any deliberative approach, any expression of deliberative democratic ideals in practice, there is a focus on participation, and what you're looking to achieve is a representative presence of the public, whoever that might be. Particular focus on that being a representative presence in demographic terms, so that it reflects gender, age, social class, ethnic minority group status, and so on, but often also diversity in terms of attitude to the issue at hand. So what you're really looking for is the opportunity for everyone to participate, that those who may not in more conventional forms be able to participate, but that everyone is enabled to participate, and that you have this diversity of opinion, this richness of opinion, which again is going to support the quality of deliberation that is possible. And as I said, in terms of the deliberation itself, the quality of this talk, this communicative action, this is the process of informed debate and the sharing of reasons between citizens. More often than not, this is a facilitated process. So it's not left to citizens to do this to themselves. The argument would be that we don't have this doesn't occur naturally. We don't have the kind of natural experience and the natural buildup of skills to deliberate. And so we need the sort of support and help of facilitators to do that. And that in this process of participation and of deliberation, this is delivering empowerment, that those involved in these approaches have been empowered to not just be involved in, but have a stake in the decision making, the conclusion reaching around a collective problem or an issue of shared concern. So in this next slide, I'll go on to talk a bit further about this deliberative turn in practice. And what we have to emphasize here is that what we're involving in deliberative approaches are what we would call lay citizens. So these are we're absolutely not talking about experts. We're also not talking about citizens who might be representatives of particular interest groups or particular lobbying organizations. So we're talking about the man and woman in the street, let's say. And that deliberative approaches have been particularly enabled through the use of a wide range of what are called mini publics to facilitate that deliberative discussion, that deliberative debate. And I'll say more about that. But within those mini publics, to enable that deliberation, there tends to be 4 key stages that citizens are taken through, are enabled to follow. And the first of those is a crucial one to allow for informed discussion and informed debate, is the provision of information and evidence giving, often through the use of expert witnesses, but also through the provision of written information, a whole range of opportunities to help citizens be informed about the topic that they're being asked to discuss and deliberate on. So there is no assumption of knowledge beforehand, and the process involves that information and evidence building, giving, and the building of the knowledge and understanding of citizens. On the basis of that, there is then an opportunity, in a sense, for citizens to reflect amongst themselves about that information and evidence. What do they understand from it? Often there is a process of questioning and answering so that citizens are allowed to pursue that understanding with the expert witnesses. And having gained that knowledge and that understanding and shared it and reflected on it with each other, the citizens are then supported to do that deliberative process, to then talk about the topic underway and to give their views and their opinions on that, but being asked to justify that and to give their reasons. And for that exchange of views, that exchange of reasons, support them to move from where they might be as individuals on that topic to move towards a more collective view. Again, the ideal may be that you reach consensus. I think in practice that is unusual and not necessary, but it is about moving people to a sense of what the kind of collective issues and collective problem is, and that even where people do not agree with the kind of general view that have been reached within a group, that there is their understanding of that. So you've got a better informed citizen, but also an understanding of the reasons for people having a different view. So in the next slide, what we've seen and described as this deliberative wave has been the increasing use of these deliberative approaches. Internationally, this has been developing over, well, I think really over decades. And some of the very early work on citizens' juries, one of the early work is some 20 to 30 years old. But I think if we were looking at the last 5 to 10 years, but particularly in the last 5 years, we've seen an increasing use and growth in the use of these mini publics by governments, by parliaments, and by other kind of formal institutions within society. And here I've just listed those that have been, to give some sense of it, present in the UK and in Ireland. The Citizens' Assembly of Ireland in 2016, a really kind of crucial one in relation to constitutional issues and the legal status of abortion. And from that, a whole range of other topics have been taken forward, both in England and Wales and at a UK level, and now increasingly in the last few years at a Scottish level. So what is striking is that this increasing, I wouldn't quite call normalization, but definitely an increasing use of these approaches. Governments themselves, before it wasn't, apart from in Ireland, in the UK it was other bodies, academics, select committee of the Parliament, not governments themselves, but governments themselves, and now the Scottish Government starting to apply these deliberative approaches to particular topics. And I think what's also worth noting is that in terms of the content of those topics, the choice of issues for discussion in these approaches, climate change has factored a lot, both within the UK, but also internationally. Health and social care has been frequently discussed, and issues, as I said, around the constitutional position. And so within Scotland, we have actually currently the examples of the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland, which I'm a co-director of research evaluating. That's underway, and in fact is due to recommence for the first time since COVID online on Saturday. So that's very exciting to start the continuation of those discussions online on Saturday. And the Scottish climate change, which was put into the climate legislation of last year, that's due to commence again soon this year, again online. But what I think is worth noting is the relative lack or relative infrequent use of these approaches, citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries in particular, in relation to criminal justice issues and policing in particular. And I'll come back to that. Okay, the next slide. So, one might say despite, but I think almost I would say in parallel with the increasing focus on deliberative democratic theory and ideals by academics, by theorists, but also the increasing operationalization of those ideals in practice, as I've just described. Alongside that, I think, and through that experience, there are a number of concerns that are increasingly coming to prominence and are increasingly coming into a consideration of how to respond to them. So the first is really a question about the effectiveness of these mini publics, of a citizens' jury, of a citizens' assembly. How effective are they in actually affecting decision making? Because each of them, in a sense, really are one-offs. They are constituted, set up and run for a particular purpose. The citizens are randomly selected to join that assembly or jury and take part. And then it finishes, and that's that. And so there is a concern that these are seen in a sense as a series of one-offs and are really rather isolated and unconnected. And the question of their affecting their decision making is really, are we left with talking shops? As I've heard one person say, this could end up being a focus group if you haven't managed to ensure that there is deliberation, that it's connected into decision making. And so related to that is not just the sort of one-off nature of them, but also that there is evidence and attached to that risk that conventional decision making and governance can remain unaffected, that the effort and the time and money put into setting these up takes most of the attention, and there less consideration is given to how the findings from that assembly or that jury, that deliberative approach, are communicated to. The notion of transmission is described in the literature. How is that transmitted into the decision-making space? Because none of these have been constituted as the site of formal decision-making. They're a route for a contribution to that decision-making. And as Papadopoulos has noted with a kind of critique of the sense that elite decision-making, the existing structures of decision-making remain unaffected, he points to the need for strategies to make participatory forms of deliberation matter more. The worry is that they matter insufficiently in the actual process of decision-making. alongside that is also a concern that those who are taking forward the practice of deliberation, of the running of these deliberative approaches, becomes increasingly technocratic. And so the sort of democratic ideals and the wider sense of the values attached to those around citizenship and so on, that some of those can get lost, and that there's an increasingly narrow focus, particularly for those interested in and engaged in the delivery of them, a narrow focus on improving the design of those forums and procedures, so that you're thinking less about deliberative democracy as a whole and much more about the success of this institution, this forum, this deliberative mini-public. And as a result, that the kind of overemphasis on the forums themselves, the mini-publics themselves, and how they're designed and how they're run to, maximize the quality of deliberation that's experienced within them, risks the neglect of what's been called the wider deliberative system. And that starts to take us back into the thinking about democracy as a whole. I don't want to say too much more than that, but really the main point to draw here is increasing emphasis from some in our thinking about deliberation, both in theory and in practice, is the need to consider what a deliberative, not just what a deliberative forum looks like, but what the deliberative system looks like, and what the constituent elements of that system need to be, and how they connect, how they couple with each other, so that the system as a whole is seen to be an expression of the deliberative democratic ideals. But alongside that is another critique or counter view that seeks to argue for the importance of what they've described as the participatory mainstream. And their argument is that this emphasis on creating these new standalone forums, these mini publics, risks us giving less attention to, less importance to, the existing conventional means by which the public can take part in decision making in a range of ways, which, while not being deliberately designed to be deliberative and necessarily designed to be as representative as deliberative mini-publics, are nonetheless an important part of that wider systemic focus on the quality of our democracy and the way in which citizens are enabled and supported to participate in decision making. And finally, in thinking about these concerns, in all of this, and speaking as someone who's been a public servant, that really what is missing in all of that discussion is the role of public servants, who often are the administrators, the decision makers, below the level of ministers. Elected representatives are taking decisions, but there are many more administrative decisions that are being taken, and which equally the public could and should be able to participate in. And so this discussion doesn't focus on that role. And I look to the work of Albert Zuer, who has done a number of bits of work talking about the need to support and encourage what he calls emergent democratic professionalism. And I'll go on to say a bit more about what he means by that in the next slide. So for Zuer, his concern is to look at those public professionals, people working in schools, people working in the health service, people working in public administration, in councils, in government, people working in the criminal justice system, looking at their role in supporting and enabling civic participation. And he encapsulates their role as being democratic professionals. And he highlights two specific ideas, two concepts that he thinks are really important to what that means, what democratic professionals, what that role is, and how they operationalize that in the way in which they work. And the first is this idea of proximity. As he says, this is about looking for ways to bring institutional and organizational practices, the practices of professionals working within their institutions and organizations, much closer to the public work that is already being done by citizens and community groups. So this isn't about selecting a random selection of citizens and bringing them into a mini public forum, which in a sense could be argued is a highly artificial space. But actually saying in the everyday work of public professionals, they should be looking for the opportunities to come alongside, to get close to the work that is being done by citizens community groups. It isn't that they aren't doing work. The question is how to get alongside that, how to be proximate to that. And in doing so, that democratic professionals should also be seeking for alignment in that. And when he talks about alignment, what he's seeking to focus on is the encouragement of co-ownership of problems, to seek out opportunities for collaborative work between who we call lay people, ordinary citizens, and professionals. So it isn't just about bringing the ways in which public servants work close to the work being done out in communities and by citizens, but also then to look at the ways in which we co-own those problems and work collaboratively. Again, a very different conception from deliberative mini-publics, where they're asked they do the deliberation, they come up with a conclusion, and that conclusion in a sense is communicated to decision makers to make decisions in another place. They're not proximate, and there isn't a kind of collaborative alignment in that model. And Zur, I think, is realistic about the challenge of this exhortation for democratic professionalism. As he says, the energy involved is a slow burn through load-bearing work, fostering relations of proximity within classrooms, hallways, administrative offices, retaken as civic spaces that refuse to be dominated by bureaucratic routines, getting close enough to see and understand others as fellow citizens. So that's a strong ambition, and the implications for public professionals he attends to in a lot of detail in relation to the identity of professionals, the expert status of professionals, what that identity means, and the implications of a notion of democratic professionalism for that. But he is able to draw on a range of examples, largely really drawn from America, of people doing this, of people acting quite quietly, but exhibiting these elements of democratic professionalism that he sets out. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So having outlined these ideals of deliberative democracy, discussed how they've been operationalized in practice through the increasing use of mini-publics in particular, and then considered some of the kind of critiques, the problematization of some of that theory and practice, I now want to go on and explore some of that within the context of policing. And my interest in this really is to draw on that, to think about the scope for what I would call democratization and deliberation in policing. In other words, the opportunities for the public not only to participate more closely in policing, but to do that within the notions of deliberation that I've set out. And I think it is arguable, but I make the argument that the notions of policing by consent that are so central to, in particular, the notion of policing in Scotland and across the UK, that if we are serious about, and that there is more to that than a kind of rhetorical reflection, that policing by consent, then we need to think hard and to think seriously about the ways in which that consent, and we could consider what we mean by consent in a range of ways, how that consent from the public is received by the police. How is that communicated and received? It's taken for granted in police research that really is tacit consent, and really it's only when there is protest that the lack of consent is expressed. But I would argue that that is insufficient as a way of operationalizing the notion of policing by consent. And when we look, UK research, you know, for many years has looked at the ways in which the police have sought to engage with the public, and has consistently really shown the limits of the conventional ways, the conventional institutions that have been used for public engagement, neighbourhood meetings, police priority meetings, and so on. But those conventional ways for police public engagement, I think, can generally be characterised in a range of ways. First of all, the evidence from these studies over many years that the participation of the public is often limited. So it's not many people actually get involved. Secondly, that those who do participate are not representative of the breadth of opinion and experience in any particular place, and actually tend to not only are not representative, but actually are particularly skewed towards particular sections of the population. So if the police are going to hear from anyone, they're going to hear from particular parts of the population and not that representative spread. And that in thinking about the quality of that interaction, there is an asymmetry and inequality of power and knowledge between the police and the public that favours the police, and that these conventional approaches are not good at overcoming or countering that asymmetry and inequality. And that actually the predominant mode in those conventional approaches is about communication and consultation, and that initiated and controlled by the police. So not at all expressing or demonstrating the characteristics of a deliberative space that I was describing earlier. And that there's absolutely limited and constrained opportunities to go beyond that communication and consultation mode into what we would be seeing as that collective problem solving, that shared collective common issues. Now, some have pointed to the inherent limits that might be possible in what we term the greater democratization of policing. Harkin in particular, in analysis of some particular empirical research on police consultation with the public, identified the form of policing as in itself inherently having some constraints on the openness, the ability of that sharing between the police and the public, and particularly focusing on the issues of secrecy, that there are just issues that the police will not, arguably cannot, share with the public, and so that sort of asymmetry of power and policing is inherent within that. However, he also recognises that there is opportunities. And so in sum, if we looked at this, I think it is arguable that unfortunately these conventional forms of engagement and public participation are regressive, or certainly risk being regressive, in that they replicate and reinforce structures and experiences of inequality in society and inequality in the experience of policing. And so the police are not able to get a rounded picture of experience, nor have the opportunity to deliberate, have a shared discussion and deliberation about the issues that are collective issues for citizens, but also with the police. Okay, in the next slide, I want to talk about an example of trying to apply a deliberative approach in a policing context. And this was a citizens' jury that I undertook 3 or so years ago in a particular place in the northeast Scotland. And this was a deliberate attempt, get my tongue around that, a deliberate attempt to explore a deliberative approach in a policing context. And I sought and received support and agreement from the police to exploring this in operation. And together with them, in fact, what's interesting to note is when explained to them what this sort of deliberative approach would apply, they actually were quite quickly able to identify a range of issues where they felt, A, they didn't have the answer, but also that there was a disagreement. There was a collective issue, but there was a disagreement on the solution, and they didn't feel they had the solution in their own hands, that they felt the application, the greater public participation and the opportunities of a deliberative approach was really had a lot of potential to it. So they were very open to that, very supportive of it. And in this particular instance, we ran a citizens jury over 2 days to discuss the future of a community organized public bonfire, a 5th of November bonfire. This bonfire in this particular place had been a long-standing, decades local tradition. People in families, grandfather, father, son, daughter, and so on, had been involved in the running and organizing of this bonfire on the 5th of November. And so it was a very strong expression of community identity and community belonging in that area. So there's very strong attachment from the community to it. And it was a community organized bonfire. But around that time, as a result of a range of things, concerns had risen amongst the police in particular, and I think with their encouragement amongst the fire service and the local council, about the size, organisation and safety of that fire. And for them, there was a problem there. They had a different view, which they did not feel that they could ignore. But in seeking to talk to community organisers, the relationships had broken down. And so there was really a lack of communication about what the future of that bonfire might be. And this citizens jury was an opportunity to bring a representative group of that local community, this is a hyperlocal, a neighbourhood in a small town in northeast Scotland, bring them together. Okay, in the next slide, what I want to, I'm not going to go into detail about the running of that jury itself, but what I wanted to draw out in relation to my discussion about Albert Zuhr's notion of democratic professionalism is these quotes from police officers and council officers who were asked to perform as expert witnesses in the jury to explain the police position and the council position on the bonfire. And that experience, I think, was, they took a lot from that experience. And these quotes, I think, exhibit that. And what I'd like to point out, first of all, is that they came understandably with expectations, which they express, expectations from their past experience of engaging with the public. So the third quote, I've been at an open public meeting and it can start to be a slanging match. And the first quote, I was pleasantly surprised by the quality of the questions I was getting asked back. So they came with assumptions based on the experience of existing ways in which they engage with the public, rather negative assumptions, and their experience within the citizens jury was very different, and they reflect very positively on that experience and note the quality of the questions, the quality of the engagement by the members of the jury, and of the quality of the conclusions that they come to. Very practical, very focused, and not idealized, but really, practical, deliverable, realistic solutions. And I think it's not a push to suggest, I think, that in their experience, you can start to see some, what I think you could call emergent democratic professionalism, that this experience has enabled them to have proximity with these citizens in a setting which was completely unusual to how they would normally engage with citizens, and that there was some alignment because all of them had a shared interest in the resolution of this problem. So there was a sense of a kind of collaborative involvement here, from which they took quite a lot. Okay, the final slide. Let me just draw out some concluding reflections. So I think the first thing to say, and to go back to the title of my talk, All Hands On, the first thing I guess I'm seeking to say is that there is a risk in deliberative democratic ideals and in the operationalizing of those in practice in many publics, that all the work, all the emphasis is placed on those forums, and it perhaps leaves other parties out of the picture. And so for me, all hands on is, in a sense, I think is a recognition, an exhortation that everyone has a part to play here. All hands on. If we are together serious about the importance of democratic participation, of citizen involvement in decision making in democracy, of citizenship itself and what that means, then it's all hands on. And what I've started to try and do is tease out what that might look like, both within these particular forums, but also the importance of the wider system, and to say something in particular about the role of public servants. And in reflecting on really where we're at in Scotland, are we close, I ask, to completing a first phase? What I mean by that is we've now got some growing confidence and experience, I would say, in the use of these mini publics in Scotland, these citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries. And with that increasing confidence experience, can we draw on some of those critiques, those problematizing perspectives on deliberative democracy to move to a wider system perspective and to increase the recognition and encouragement of what I've identified as democratic professionalism? That's a general question. In relation to policing, it causes me to consider whether the contemporary conditions in policing support and encourage the democratizing moves that I think we can see elsewhere. As I reflected, policing and criminal justice more widely seem to be further back. That would be my observation from my perspective. So, do we feel that the contemporary conditions in policing are ones that could support that? The COVID crisis gives us an opportunity to explain, engage, and encourage. A deliberative approach could have been very useful in that scenario. And finally, the role of academia, the importance of expert witnesses, the importance of understanding research says a lot, I think, about the importance of academics in that role of public engagement, but also what they take from an experience of being an expert witness in many publics. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. That's fascinating. We have a number of questions. So first of all, I'll just go through some of them. So an observation from Shane Horgan saying that it raises some interesting questions about consent, and it would be interesting to consider it in a digital or cyber arena to examine that arena through this lens. So not a question, more of an observation. There's a few from me, but I'll skim over those for now. There's a question about from Daniel Santos. How are the conflicts arising from the interaction of many publics within a larger organization dealt with? If you'd like to take that one first, Nick.
How are the conflicts dealt with? Yeah.
Yeah, it says, how are the conflicts arising from
That's a good
interaction
question.
of many
I'm not
publics
sure
within a large organization?
I think that points to the system point I was making, that actually, if many public, you would expect challenges from the views of many publics into the wider system, into that decision making. And I think the fact that we haven't seen that is suggestive that they aren't quite making the inroads that we might expect them to do. You know, the argument is that they haven't had that purchase on existing forms of decision making that they should do, and so that challenge doesn't quite come. I think that's quite a generalized picture, but I think it's the fact that we haven't seen as much challenge is indicative of, in a sense, where we're at and their lack of more systemic impact.
Mm-hmm. I think that links into the next question. Instead of asking people to open up, I'm just going to ask the questions in the interest of time because we've only got a few minutes left. Presuming we're going to get cut off at past. I'm not sure. Monica can maybe tell me. Question from Hannah. There's a substantial amount of capacity building required before many citizens are able to participate. Oh, sorry, there was two questions from Hannah. The first one, some of these responses speak to some cultural mindset issues within public services. So how do we overcome these and mainstream participatory and deliberative processes in public service?
I completely agree. There's a strong cultural element to that. I think that's, so speaking as someone who works in Scottish Government, I think the importance of public participation, the use of more innovative approaches has increased. A recognition that the conventional approaches that we've used for consultation have been inadequate. During the COVID crisis, there was an online consultation with the public that allowed for interaction online of views. It wasn't just to kind of give your views. There was an interactive element. So I agree. I think there's a lot to do. And I think certainly speaking for within Scottish Government, there is, you know, people doing that and examples to draw on. And I have sought to, you know, encourage and support that through my own experience. So I think it's an organizational development process. It's a maturity in our understanding, our confidence in this, both as a system, but also within the individual public service organizations, the police and any others.
Also a question from Jonathan. Interesting to flag asymmetries of knowledge and power between police and publics. Could you say more about if or how deliberative processes might address asymmetries of power, please?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, within the deliberative forums, the expert witnessing and the information giving is aimed at doing that. So you're providing evidence from academics, from other experts, and information to give them that knowledge, so that certainly in terms of their understanding, they're much closer to the police. And certainly, just from my experience in that mini public, that the setting itself, the physical space, but the kind of interactive space was equalizing. The police who came as witnesses had 10 minutes to give their view, only 10 minutes, and then a very long 40-minute session for Q&A, where they were answering any questions asked by the jury members. So, you know, the space sought to be empowering of citizens in terms of their control of the agenda, so to speak, but also in bringing them up to a greater level of knowledge. So but that's very much within that setting, that forum. It doesn't change the asymmetries of power and knowledge outside of those, but in that particular use of that deliberative approach, that sought absolutely explicitly sought to tackle that issue in that way.
Thank you. I'm told we can go over time, so I appreciate some people have had to leave already, but I'm told by Monica that we can go over time. We're not going to get kicked
I'm sorry for going on for so long.
No, we were late starting as well. So in light of that, would anyone like to open up to answer a question rather than me asking it? So the next one I have on my list is Andy. Andy, would you like to turn on your mic and your camera and ask the question if you're able to? If not, I'll ask it for you. There may be a technical problem there because... Oh.
Hi.
Hi, Andy.
Hi, Nick. Thanks very much for a really interesting talk. My question was, to what extent do you feel that collective deliberation should be taken in relation to Scottish policing? For example, should there be a space for the collective view to be garnered in relation to how police recruits are educated? And in particular, I'm thinking about the rather hot debate about whether Scotland should follow the English and Welsh approach and introducing a graduate entry only model.
So I think in principle, well, I would start from the position that any issue is open to the application of these approaches. How you precisely do it would need to be thought about, but there can be the benefits of this approach are in a range of ways. So not least building the knowledge and understanding of citizens about the recruitment process, about what being a police officer is about. Yeah, what that identity. We have kind of stereotyped, media-driven views about what it means to be a police officer, to become a police officer. But and deliberative approaches, certainly for those involved, are precisely one element of those. It is a learning opportunity, a knowledge gaining opportunity for those citizens who are involved. So that's in that direction. It's about giving citizens a better knowledge and understanding of the decisions and the choices that you and your colleagues are having to make about recruitment. From a policing angle, then I think again, because it's deliberative, it's not you're going to work with a set of citizens who have been informed of the challenges you face and the choices that you have to make, and then you're able to get into a discussion with them where you get their perspective on that. And certainly in principle, you may be either surprised because they completely agree with you, or surprised because they come up with something different. But I think for me, it's the information, it's the evidence, it's the building of their understanding, and then their opportunity to share and debate and deliberate that gets you to a place that, and they're not coming from or a professional perspective. They're coming from well, I'm a citizen on the street and I look to a police officer for the things I look to a police officer for. So I think it offers the opportunity for a completely different perspective, which in the end can guide or not guide your decisions, but I think provides you with a more informed perspective, to a more rounded picture, let's say.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much,
Andy. Thanks for your question, Andy.
We have another question which Katrina Morrison has asked me to ask, which is, in order for debate to be informed, in quotes, participants must have the ability to think about issues. Do you think that education may be part of people's ability to do this, or is that something that an educated elite would say? And if so, what is the solution in relation to this?
Well, thanks, Katrina. That's another really good question. And you're right; they do need to be informed. So I suppose a sort of couple of answers to this. First of all, my experience, both in the jury in the citizens' jury I did in the northeast of Scotland, was in a very deprived area. So we were working with people of lower educational qualifications, lower social class, and they were absolutely able to engage in this. Absolutely, and you've seen some of the quotes about the reaction of police officers and the council's experience of that. So were they able to? If that was a population that you might think, would they have some challenges with this? They really went into some really good discussions. One discussion about responsibility. Who's responsible for safety? If I know that the bonfire's not safe as a mother, should I take mine? So they got in some really sophisticated debates. That's the first thing to say. And I've seen this in the Citizens Assembly of Scotland equally. We've got people with learning disabilities, other physical disabilities, who are provided with some sort of support. But yeah, absolutely, people are able to engage in that. And then that diversity is that rich mix is part of the strengths of this approach. From a system perspective, so those who would talk about deliberative systems, then I think yes, they would talk about the important role of education, and I think they might make more focus on citizenship. So how much are we as citizens supported, encouraged, and provided with the skills to be the active, involved citizens that this approach and this perspective encourages. So they would, from that system perspective, absolutely see a role for education in less in deliberation itself, but in that engaged, informed citizen.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Hannah. So it was the second question that Hannah had, and again she's asked me to pose it for you. So this is with regards to the fact that there's a substantial amount of capacity building required before many citizens are able to participate meaningfully in these processes. So it links with the last question. So whose responsibility is this? She appreciates that these processes can act as a capacity building thing in and of themselves.
Yeah, sorry, another good question, and you're quite right. I mean, the experience of going through this builds confidence, builds knowledge, builds capacity. So a citizen who has gone through a deliberative approach like this, particularly an assembly which is quite long, I mean, could be 6 weekends, 8 weekends, or something. At the end of that, they're a very different kind of citizen to at the beginning. I suppose I'd say a number of things. First of all, and back to my answer to Katrina, that you can work with any citizen. So that every citizen has the capacity inherently to participate in this. But I think that's not to say that there isn't support for inclusion. The aim of these approaches are to be inclusive, both in terms of who is involved, but also in their ability to be included within the discussions themselves. And so, yeah, a lot of effort is placed into that. At a minimum level, everyone gets paid. People get paid because they're being asked to do a decent bit of work, but also because they would need some compensation for childcare and other things. So there's a sense of, we don't want economic disadvantage to get in the way of people's opportunity to participate. So that'd be one kind of disadvantage or lack of capacity, that financial capacity. But within the actual running of it, and particularly in the Citizens Assembly of Scotland, the Secretariat, who are running that assembly, they're kind of the organisers, the administrators of it, have put a great deal of attention into supporting the support needs of individual members. So members with physical disabilities or learning disabilities. And so they put in place particular kinds of support, one-to-one support, but also material resource and so on, that would enable people to be fully participative in the discussions.
I've been asked to ask. This is about the fact that she finds this really interesting, but it's also a bit overwhelming because it feels like a huge shift. And basically, what's the best way to go about it? Is it best to start things at a smaller level, or to build up to something bigger, or is that really making the change that is really needed? Then do it like that.
I'm quoting somebody else here whose name I can't remember, but an advocate in a sense of kind of system change or transformation is start where you are and do what you can. So I as individuals, in whatever kind of roles we sit in, as academics, as professionals, as public administrators, government, civil servants, or whatever, then as individuals, I think you can start where you are, and you can seek to influence others, seek to influence your organization in your institution. But for me, I think I have seen over the last 4 or 5 years of my involvement with this, a range of people who, like me, have started to learn about this and get involved in it and have motivation to it, doing their bit. And as I said at the beginning, this is about, the collective citizenship, being involved in collective problems. So as individuals collectively, then we make an impact. The citizens jury I ran 4 years ago was a very small affair. Didn't cost a lot of money. Had support of a great team of other academics and the police and others locally. But that was a very small affair. But for me, was the beginnings of an experiment in the learning and the opportunities for that. And that was one part of the journey where we made by the First Minister to have the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland considering the future of Scotland. So to deciding on that.
Thanks very much, Nick. I'm going to take Chair's prerogative now and ask one final question before we come to a close. So I'm struck by the fact that, we're thinking about examples of this in policing. And I can think of, I suppose, one small example involved in the chairing the cyber kiosks external reference group, and Police Scotland did more work than I'd seen them do before with regard to consulting with various citizens groups and getting people together to look at consent forms and things like that. And I hadn't seen that happen to that extent before. But it strikes me that this would also be interesting, as well as bringing citizens in and engaging with the citizens in a more meaningfully deliberative way. Surely this approach would also be useful within organisations like the police, in order to utilise deliberative approaches internally in line with an organisationally just approach. Just wondered your thoughts on that.
That's a really good reflection, Liz. Absolutely. I didn't say this explicitly, but participation and deliberation are distinct. So approaches that focus on citizen participation need not be deliberative, and approaches that focus on deliberation need not be about citizen participation. So we could want to have better deliberation in the UK or Scottish Parliament. The quality of debate is not deliberative. People just say, I think this, or you're wrong, rather than I think this and let me share your reasons. Now you tell me your reason. Yeah. So I think there is proponents of deliberative talk, because it is about the quality of talk, the quality of communication and exchange between people. Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's about getting to a greater depth of understanding. And I go back to the values, the mutual respect and equality. So we're trying to, in a sense, create conditions that says everyone's voice counts. Everyone has the opportunity to give their voice, but in giving your voice, explain the reasons for what you have, because this is a very rationalist kind of perspective, but the reasoning, by giving our reasons and exchanging our reasons, we will have the argument would be we will have a higher quality debate, as well as building a sense of mutual kind of respect and understanding. So you could see an instrumental benefit that you might get to a kind of better policy or a better decision. But if the argument being that we're creating better relationships amongst citizens, why would that not apply to citizens in uniform operating in their job?
Thank you very much. I think we'll draw the session to a close at this point. So I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking Nick. We can't do it in the usual way with a round of applause. So in a virtual sense, we're receiving some virtual hand claps emojis, so that's reassuring. And thank you very much, Nick, for a really interesting seminar, very thought-provoking, I think, for many of those involved based on the feedback. So thanks for your time, and we look forward to having you again another event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lee. Can I just end by thanking everyone for positive response. First time I've done an online thing from this end rather than sitting watching. But also to say, if people are interested, I'm very open and interested in further collaboration, further discussion. So encourage people to do please get in touch. I'd welcome the opportunity to pursue things further with whoever wants to.
Great, and I understand from Monica that we'll put Nick's slides on the SIPR website, and this recording I think will also be made available. So thank you all for joining on your lunchtime, and thanks again to Nick. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Liz.
Bye now.